German fighter aces laughed at the B-17's size and called it a flying coffin. Then they poured hundreds of cannon rounds into one bomber, watched it tear apart in the sky, and froze in disbelief as it kept flying home, proving they weren't fighting an aircraft, but a war machine designed to survive. In the autumn of 1942, German fighter pilots believed they understood the American bomber. From the cockpit of an FW-190 or a BF-109, the B-17 Flying Fortress looked exactly like what they expected. Big, slow, clumsy, a massive silhouette hanging in the sky, unable to dodge, unable to run. To experienced Luftwaffe aces who had carved through lighter bombers in Poland, France, and the early skies over Britain, it seemed almost insulting. They called it the heavy baby. This confidence was reinforced on the ground. At the Rechlin test facility, the Luftwaffe's most experienced engineers and tacticians examined wreckage from early American raids. They measured armor thickness, counted bullet holes, and calculated kill probabilities. Their conclusion was clinical and mathematical. Destroy the engines, shatter the cockpit, break the wings. According to their estimates, a B-17 should fall after sustained cannon fire. It was only a matter of volume and precision, nothing more. What the Germans believed they were facing was an aircraft problem, a technical equation that superior pilots and better tactics would inevitably solve. What they did not yet understand was that the B-17 was not built to avoid damage. It was built to expect it. Every assumption the Luftwaffe had made about air combat was rooted in agility and speed. Fighters survived by not being hit. Bombers survived by slipping through gaps or relying on escorts. The B-17 rejected both ideas. Its designers assumed it would be hit repeatedly and designed the aircraft to keep flying anyway. Redundant systems, overlapping structure, engines that could be shot to pieces and still turn, wings that could lose sections and remain attached. To German pilots, this philosophy was invisible at first. All they saw was a slow, oversized target drifting across hostile airspace in tight formations, something that should die quickly. But the first encounters over occupied Europe began to challenge that belief. Cannon shells struck aluminum skin and failed to break the airframe apart. Engines burned, yet continued to run. Bombers limped away, trailing smoke, holes punched clean through their fuselages, only to reappear days later in new formations. Pilots began reporting kills that never materialized. Wrecks they swore they saw fall simply did not exist. Still, confidence held because confidence was doctrine. The Luftwaffe believed they were learning how to kill the B-17 faster. In reality, the B-17 was teaching them something far more dangerous, that they were fighting an enemy designed not to win cleanly, but to survive punishment long enough to come back again. And when something can absorb your best blows and return in greater numbers the next day, the battle is no longer tactical. It becomes something else entirely. The real test came when theory collided with reality. In August 1942, small formations of B-17 seconds began flying daylight missions over occupied Europe. These were not massive armadas yet, but cautious probes meant to test defenses, crews, and doctrine. To the Luftwaffe, they looked like opportunities. Veteran pilots scrambled with confidence, expecting quick victories against what appeared to be slow, predictable bombers. The intercepts unfolded exactly as German doctrine prescribed. Fighters climbed above the formations, rolled into steep dives, and fired concentrated bursts of 20mm cannon fire at engines and cockpits. From the attacker's perspective, the results looked devastating. Metal tore away. Fuel streamed into the air. Bombers slipped out of formation trailing smoke. Pilots radioed confident kill claims. By every rule of air combat they knew, these aircraft should have been finished. But then something disturbing happened. The bombers did not fall. Damaged B-17 seconds stabilized, rejoined formation, and continued toward their targets. Engines that should have seized kept turning. Control surfaces that appeared shredded still responded. The formations did not scatter or break. They held steady, their gunners pouring out disciplined, overlapping fire that forced German pilots to break away sooner than planned. Instead of collapsing, the bomber streams pushed on, dropped their bombs, and turned for home. When the missions ended, intelligence officers reviewed the results and uncovered an uncomfortable truth. Aircraft reported destroyed had landed safely in England. Crews walked away from bombers riddled with holes large enough to crawl through. Ground crews photographed fortresses with sections missing, patched just enough to fly again. What looked like destruction from a fighter cockpit was often only damage. This was deeply unsettling. The Luftwaffe relied on visual confirmation and experience. Pilots trusted what they saw. Now, their eyes were lying to them. Each interception demanded more ammunition, closer passes, and greater exposure to defensive fire, yet certainty of results vanished. German pilots began to realize that the B-17 did not behave like any bomber they had faced before. It did not evade. It did not panic. It absorbed punishment and kept moving forward as if damage were an expected cost rather than a fatal mistake. Still, confidence did not collapse. The conclusion drawn was not that the flying fortress was unstoppable, but that it required refinement in tactics, heavier weapons, more aggressive angles, better coordination. The problem, they believed, could still be solved with experience and innovation. What they did not yet see was the imbalance forming beneath the surface. Every interception cost Germany skilled pilots and aircraft that could not be easily replaced. Every damaged B-17 that returned preserved its crew, its experience, and its place in the next mission. The exchange rate was quietly turning against them. The Luftwaffe thought it was learning how to kill the fortress. In reality, it was learning how expensive killing it truly was. As the missions multiplied, the air war began to produce events that no amount of training or experience could easily explain. German pilots were no longer just encountering bombers that survived heavy damage, they were witnessing outcomes that seemed to defy physics itself. Aircraft broke apart in midair, crews were thrown clear, and yet men who should have died instantly were later reported alive. These were not rumors, they were confirmed cases documented by both sides. One of the most shocking incidents occurred in January 1943 over Saint-Nazaire. During a flak barrage, a B-17 was hit so violently that it disintegrated in the air. The aircraft entered an uncontrolled spin, tearing itself apart as it fell. In the chaos, the ball turret was ripped from the bomber's belly and hurled into open sky. Inside it was Staff Sergeant Alan McGee. He was unconscious, without a parachute, falling from more than 22,000 feet. By every law of combat experience, McGee should have died within seconds. Instead, 2 minutes later, his body crashed through the glass roof of a railway station. German soldiers rushed to the scene expecting to recover remains. What they found was a living man, mangled, bleeding, barely breathing, but alive. A Luftwaffe surgeon later looked at him in disbelief and asked a question that echoed across the air war. "How are you still alive?" McGee survived. He spent the rest of the war as a prisoner. His case was extreme, but it was not unique. Reports accumulated of tail gunners riding severed fuselage sections thousands of feet to the ground and living. Bombers collided with fighters, lost engines, lost wings, and still flew for an hour or more before landing. Maintenance crews counted hundreds of bullet and flak holes in aircraft that had somehow brought their crews home. What had once been considered miracles became patterns. For the Luftwaffe, this created a crisis of understanding. Pilots were doing everything right, executing textbook attacks, scoring hits, watching aircraft break apart, and yet the enemy kept returning. Kill claims no longer aligned with strategic reality. The B-17 was undermining the basic feedback loop of air combat. Effort no longer produced proportional results. The psychological effect was corrosive. German pilots began to fear the bomber formations, not because they were unbeatable, but because they were unreliable to fight. A fighter could risk its life, fire its ammunition, and still achieve nothing measurable. Each mission felt like gambling against an enemy that did not play by familiar rules. What was becoming clear was that the flying fortress had turned survivability into a weapon. It forced the Luftwaffe to expend time, fuel, ammunition, and lives just to reduce, not eliminate, the pressure. Damage that should have removed aircraft from the war instead merely delayed them. Crews survived, learned, and returned. On the American side, these same stories were read very differently. They were taken as proof of the fortress's promise. Each survival reinforced the belief that the bomber could endure anything. What was missed was the warning hidden inside those stories. Survival was not invulnerability, and endurance had limits. By late 1943, the pattern was unmistakable. The B-17 was rewriting the rules of air combat, not by being indestructible, but by breaking the enemy's expectations of what destruction even meant. The Luftwaffe was learning that killing a flying fortress required certainty, not probability. And certainty, in a war of growing scale, was becoming impossibly expensive. By 1943, the illusion was gone. The Luftwaffe no longer laughed at the flying fortress. It studied it with grim urgency. German commanders accepted what frontline pilots already knew. Conventional tactics were no longer enough. The B-17 could not be reliably destroyed by rear attacks, engine hits, or partial structural damage. If the bomber was to be stopped, its crew had to be killed outright. This realization drove the Luftwaffe toward increasingly extreme solutions. Fighters began attacking head-on, flying directly into the bomber's nose at closing speeds that left no margin for error. These attacks were brutal, fast, and terrifying. Pilots had seconds to aim, fire, and break away before colliding with the bomber or being shredded by defensive fire. Losses were severe, but it worked often enough to justify the risk. At the same time, German aircraft themselves were transformed. Light fighters were burdened with heavier cannons. Twin-engine interceptors were fitted with rockets and massive forward-firing guns designed to break bomber formations from a distance. Each adaptation increased firepower, but reduced maneuverability and survivability. The Luftwaffe was trading flexibility for desperation. And yet, even these measures were not enough. While Germany was forcing more and more effort into destroying each bomber, the United States was drawing a dangerously different conclusion. Early missions with low loss rates had hardened a belief that predated the war, that massed bomber formations could defend themselves. The stories of fortresses returning riddled with holes were taken not as warnings, but as confirmation. Escort fighters were seen as helpful, but not essential. This belief became doctrine. B-17 formations were sent deeper into Germany, beyond the range of available fighter escort. Planners assumed that defensive guns and structural durability would compensate for isolation. For a brief time, the gamble seemed to work. But the Luftwaffe was learning faster than the Americans were adapting. Then the reckoning came. Over Regensburg, Münster, and Schweinfurt, unescorted bomber streams were isolated and systematically destroyed. German fighters attacked in waves, exploiting every weakness they had learned at terrible cost. Entire formations were dismantled over the course of hours. Loss rates soared to levels that could not be sustained. Crews fought bravely. Bombers absorbed astonishing punishment. It did not matter. The fortress could survive damage, but not abandonment. By late 1943, the truth was undeniable. The B-17 was neither the fragile target German pilots once mocked, nor the invincible weapon American planners had imagined. It was something far more specific and far more dangerous when used correctly. It was a machine designed to endure just long enough for a system behind it to function. Until that system existed, the skies over Europe became a killing ground. Both sides had finally learned the same lesson from opposite directions. The Germans understood that they were not fighting an aircraft, but an industrial machine that could outlast them. The Americans understood that survivability without protection was not strength, it was delay before catastrophe. The flying fortress had exposed the limits of confidence, the cost of assumption, and the unforgiving nature of modern war. And now, with blood already paid for those lessons, the final transformation was about to begin. The collapse of the unescorted bombing doctrine forced a hard reckoning inside the United States Army Air Forces. What had failed in 1943 was not courage nor engineering, but understanding. The Flying Fortress had done exactly what it was designed to do, absorb damage and keep its crew alive, but it had been asked to fight alone in a war that no single weapon could win by itself. The solution was not to make the B-17 tougher. It was to complete the system it was always meant to be part of. The first correction came in steel and machinery. The B-17G, the definitive version of the aircraft, closed the most lethal vulnerability the Luftwaffe had exploited. A powered chin turret with twin 50 caliber machine guns was installed beneath the nose, eliminating the blind spot that made head-on attacks so effective. German pilots, who had once relied on frontal passes, now flew directly into concentrated fire. Loss rates during these attacks rose sharply, and a tactic born of desperation became prohibitively costly. Electronic warfare followed. Chaff, known as window, was released in massive quantities, blinding German radar and fracturing interception coordination. Jamming disrupted communications between fighters and ground control. Carefully timed defenses dissolved into confusion. German fighters were still dangerous, but they were increasingly blind, late, and uncoordinated. Yet the decisive change did not come from bombers at all. It came from escort fighters that could finally stay. The arrival of the P-51 Mustang transformed the air war completely. With its long range, high performance, and reliability, the Mustang could escort B-17 formations from England to Germany and back again. The Flying Fortress was no longer a lone porcupine bristling in self-defense. It became the armored core of a moving death system, bombers drawing the enemy upward, fighters destroying them in sustained combat. The effect on the Luftwaffe was catastrophic. Interceptors were engaged before they reached the bombers. Fighters returning to refuel were attacked on the ground. Pilot losses mounted faster than replacements could be trained. Experience vanished. Morale collapsed. Even successful engagements no longer altered the strategic balance. By early 1944, the air war had crossed a point of no return. The Flying Fortress had achieved its true purpose not by being indestructible, but by surviving long enough for the system behind it to crush the enemy. Germany was no longer fighting pilots or aircraft. It was fighting time, production, and mathematics. German commanders understood this. Adolf Galland would later admit that the problem was never tactical, it was industrial. For every B-17 destroyed, more appeared. For every pilot lost, the Luftwaffe grew weaker in a way it could not repair. The exchange rate was fatal. When Allied bombers filled the sky during Big Week in February 1944, protected by long-range escorts, the Luftwaffe was forced into open battle and annihilated. Fighter production was smashed. Training units were destroyed. The defense of German airspace collapsed. The Flying Fortress did not win the air war by itself. It won by enduring long enough for the enemy to break. In the end, the Germans had been right about one thing. The B-17 was slow, heavy, and impossible to maneuver. But they were catastrophically wrong about what that meant. Its bulk was not a weakness. It was a declaration. This was not a war of finesse. It was a war of endurance. And in that war, the Flying Fortress proved that survival itself could be the most decisive weapon of all. In October 1942, German pilots laughed at the Flying Fortress. They believed they were facing a flawed aircraft, too big, too slow, too easy to hit. They counted cannon rounds, refined attack angles, and trusted their experience to deliver victory. What they never counted was time. Because the B-17 was never meant to win dogfights, it was built to endure long enough for something larger to take effect. Every bomber that limped home preserved its crew. Every crew that survived learned. Every lesson was fed back into a system that adapted faster than its enemy could recover. The Luftwaffe fought with skill, courage, and innovation. But skill could not replace pilots fast enough. Courage could not refill fuel tanks. Innovation could not outproduce an enemy whose factories worked beyond the horizon of destruction. By the time German commanders understood the truth, the sky itself had turned against them. The Flying Fortress did not break Germany through elegance or precision. It broke it through persistence. through mathematics, through the brutal logic of a war where survival was multiplied by industry and protected by doctrine. When the B-17 filled the skies in 1944, escorted from coast to coast, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The war had moved beyond tactics and entered the realm of inevitability. Germany was no longer fighting aircraft or pilots. It was fighting a system that could absorb its best blows and return the next day in greater numbers. That is the final lesson of the Flying Fortress. In modern war, victory does not belong to the fastest, the bravest, or the most skilled in a single moment. It belongs to the side that can endure damage, learn from it, and keep coming back until the enemy can no longer do the same. By the time the war in Europe entered its final year, the laughter was long gone. The sky above Germany no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like a ceiling that was slowly closing in. German pilots still flew, still fought, still died with skill and courage, but something essential had already been lost. They were no longer shaping the battle. They were reacting to it. The B-17 Flying Fortress had not achieved this moment by being perfect. In fact, it had been imperfect in ways that were obvious from the start. It was slow. It was large. It could not evade. It could not hide. Every mission exposed it to danger. And yet, mission after mission, it kept coming back, not untouched, not triumphant, but intact enough to fly again. That distinction matters. The Flying Fortress did not promise safety. It promised survival. And survival, multiplied across thousands of aircraft and tens of thousands of crews, became something far more powerful than invincibility. It became inevitability. German pilots eventually understood what they were facing. They named the bomber formations flying porcupines not as mockery, but as warning. Attacking them meant pain. It meant loss. It meant risking everything for a result that might not even register strategically. For every bomber destroyed, another replaced it. For every crew lost, another trained and arrived. The exchange rate no longer favored bravery or brilliance. This was not how air combat had been imagined before the war. For decades, victory in the air had been associated with mastery aces, maneuver, individual excellence. The B-17 erased that romantic illusion. It revealed a harsher truth. In modern industrial war, individual superiority cannot overcome a system designed to absorb loss and continue functioning. The Luftwaffe did not fail because its pilots lacked courage. They did not fail because their aircraft were poorly designed. They failed because they were drawn into a conflict where endurance mattered more than excellence, and where the enemy could afford losses they could not replace. On the American side, the cost was staggering. Tens of thousands of airmen never came home. Entire crews vanished over Germany, leaving only empty bunks and folded flags. Survivability did not mean survival for everyone. It meant survival for enough. Enough to keep learning. Enough to keep pressure constant. Enough to break the enemy's capacity to respond. That is a difficult truth to confront. The Flying Fortress did not make war humane. It made it systematic. It turned suffering into a variable that could be calculated, endured, and ultimately exploited. This is why the story of the B-17 is unsettling even in victory. It shows that modern war is not decided by who is right or who is brave, but by who can endure longer at scale. By early 1944, when long-range escorts finally sealed the system, the outcome was sealed as well. The Luftwaffe rose to meet the bomber streams and was destroyed in the process. Factories burned. Training units were wiped out. Fuel shortages grounded what remained. Germany still fought on, but the air war, the struggle for control of the sky, was over. And once the sky was lost, everything beneath it followed. Cities became vulnerable. Industry became exposed. Armies lost mobility. Supply lines fractured. The Flying Fortress had not won the war alone, but it had removed the enemy's ability to fight it effectively. That was its true strategic achievement. After the war, German commanders were brutally honest. Adolf Galland, who had once analyzed the B-17 as a technical challenge, admitted the truth. The problem, he said, was not tactical. It was industrial. It was mathematical. It was unwinnable from the moment Germany committed to a war of attrition against a nation that could build faster than it could be destroyed. That admission is the epitaph of the Flying Fortress. Because the B-17 was never just an airplane. It was the visible edge of a deeper reality, one where design, philosophy, production capacity, doctrine, and time mattered more than any single engagement. It was a declaration that this war would not be decided by moments, but by months and years of sustained pressure. Its legacy did not end in 1945. The lessons of the Flying Fortress shaped everything that followed. American aircraft would forever prioritize survivability, redundancy, and crew protection. From strategic bombers to ground attack aircraft, the DNA of the B-17 lived on not as nostalgia, but as doctrine. More broadly, the B-17 left behind a warning. It showed what happens when a nation misunderstands the nature of modern conflict. When it believes spirit can replace material. When it believes brilliance can overcome arithmetic. When it believes the next innovation will arrive in time to undo a structural disadvantage. Germany believed all of these things. And they were wrong. The Flying Fortress did not defeat Germany by surprise. It defeated Germany by patience. It accepted damage. It accepted loss. It accepted imperfection. And it kept coming. That is why the Germans stopped laughing. Not because the bomber was terrifying in appearance, but because it represented something they could not defeat, an enemy that could endure punishment, learn from it, and return tomorrow stronger than today. In the end, the story of the B-17 is not about steel, engines, or guns. It is about understanding the true nature of power. Power is not always speed. It is not always elegance. Sometimes, power is the ability to take a hit, remain functional, and keep moving forward while the enemy exhausts itself trying to stop you. The Flying Fortress proved that in modern war, survival itself can become the decisive weapon. And once that lesson is learned, once endurance replaces illusion, the outcome is no longer a matter of chance. It is only a matter of time. The story of the B-17 Flying Fortress is not the story of an indestructible machine. It is the story of how power is misunderstood and the price paid when belief collides with the reality of modern war. The first lesson the B-17 teaches is brutal in its simplicity. Not every conflict is decided by skill or brilliance. The Luftwaffe entered the war with experienced pilots, refined tactics, and confidence earned through early victories. For a time, that confidence was justified, but as the war expanded, skill alone stopped being enough. When your enemy can replace losses faster than you can inflict them, war ceases to be an art and becomes mathematics. The Flying Fortress exposed that truth mercilessly. The second lesson is that endurance is not a defensive trait, it is an offensive weapon. The B-17 did not avoid damage, it accepted it. It was built with the assumption that it would be hit, torn open, and pushed to the edge of failure. As long as it brought its crew home, it had succeeded. Each surviving crew carried experience forward. Each surviving aircraft preserved pressure. Over time, survival itself became strategic momentum. The Luftwaffe did not lose because it lacked courage. It lost because each success failed to change the balance, while each B-17 that survived quietly tilted it further against them. The third lesson is more subtle and more dangerous. When the metrics you use to measure success no longer reflect reality, you are already losing even if you don't know it yet. German pilots reported bombers destroyed. They saw aircraft burning, breaking apart, falling out of formation. Yet many of those bombers landed safely. Kill claims no longer translated into strategic effect. The feedback loop of air combat collapsed, and doctrine followed it into failure. The fourth lesson comes from the American side, and it was paid for in blood. Survivability is not invulnerability. Early missions with low losses reinforced a pre-war belief that bombers could defend themselves. The Flying Fortress seemed to confirm it. That belief hardened into doctrine. and in 1943 thousands of airmen paid the price. Endurance delayed destruction, but it could not prevent it when bombers were sent deep into hostile airspace alone. From this comes the fifth lesson. Power only emerges when systems are complete. The B-17 was never meant to fight by itself. When paired with long-range escorts, electronic warfare, numbers, and correct doctrine, it became the core of an overwhelming system. Alone, it was only a target waiting longer to die. Durability has meaning only when the system around it knows how to use it. The sixth lesson is profoundly human. Systems that protect people outlast systems that consume them. The United States invested in bringing crews home. Germany burned through pilots faster than it could train replacements. Once experience vanished, no tactic could save the Luftwaffe. In modern war, people are not a renewable resource, and the side that forgets that loses. The seventh lesson is a warning beyond World War II. Do not confuse sophistication with effectiveness. German aircraft were often faster, their weapons more powerful on paper, their tactics more elegant. The B-17 was none of those things. It was built to function when conditions were worst, when damaged, imperfect, and under stress. Systems designed only for ideal conditions fail first when reality intrudes. The final lesson of the Flying Fortress is about time. Modern war is not won in moments, but in endurance. Germany fought brilliantly, but it could not endure longer than a nation that could produce faster, learn quicker, and replace losses endlessly. The outcome was decided not by a single battle, but by sustained pressure that could not be matched. The B-17 did not win because it was invincible. It won because it refused to disappear. And that is the most unsettling lesson of all. In wars of attrition, survival itself becomes the decisive weapon. What makes the lesson of the B-17 so enduring is not that it belongs to the past, but that it describes a pattern that repeats whenever humans mistake intensity for sustainability. The Flying Fortress forces us to confront a reality that is uncomfortable precisely because it applies far beyond war. Strength that cannot be sustained is not strength at all. The Luftwaffe fought with extraordinary intensity. Its pilots flew more missions per man, faced higher risks per engagement, and relied on sharper tactics to offset material disadvantage. In the short term, this produced impressive results. In the long term, it hollowed the force from the inside. Exhaustion replaced confidence. Loss replaced experience. By the end, German pilots were not defeated in battle, they were worn down by a system that demanded more than it could ever replace. The B-17 accelerated that process because it forced the enemy to fight at maximum effort every time. There was no cheap way to deal with a flying fortress formation. Every interception required fuel, coordination, ammunition, and exposure to defensive fire. Nothing about it was efficient for the attacker. Over time, inefficiency became fatal. This reveals another lesson. Forcing your enemy into inefficient responses is often more powerful than destroying them outright. The B-17 did not need to win every encounter. It needed to force Germany to respond expensively, repeatedly, and everywhere. Every fighter scrambled to intercept bombers was a fighter, not training, not resting, not conserved. Every pilot lost in an attack that worked still weakened a system that had no depth. Pressure, applied consistently, reshaped the entire German war economy. This pressure also distorted German decision-making. As bomber raids intensified, resources were diverted away from offensive capability and toward defense. Fighters were pulled back from the Eastern Front. Anti-aircraft guns multiplied around cities and factories. Production facilities were dispersed, reducing efficiency. Each decision made sense in isolation. Together, they strangled Germany's ability to fight a coherent war. Here lies another critical lesson. Systems under constant stress begin optimizing for survival, not victory. The Luftwaffe increasingly fought to reduce damage rather than to regain control. The goal shifted from dominance to delay. That shift marked the true strategic defeat long before the war officially ended. The B-17 did not just damage Germany's aircraft, it reshaped Germany's priorities. On the American side, the contrast is striking. The USAAF also suffered grievously, especially in 1943. Crews were lost at rates that shook morale. Missions felt suicidal. Yet the system absorbed those losses and adjusted. Doctrine changed. Escort fighters were accelerated. Electronic warfare was expanded. Training was refined. The pain was real, but it produced adaptation instead of paralysis. This leads to a deeper insight. Suffering only becomes meaningful when it changes behavior. The early losses of the bomber force were not noble sacrifices in themselves. They mattered only because the system learned from them. When institutions refuse to learn, loss becomes waste. When they adapt, loss becomes momentum. The Flying Fortress was effective not because it prevented suffering, but because it existed inside a structure capable of learning faster than the enemy. The B-17 also challenges a common misconception about technology, that superior machines alone determine outcomes. In truth, technology only amplifies the values of the system using it. The Fortress amplified American industrial depth, American doctrine, and American willingness to redesign strategy under pressure. In a different system, it might have failed catastrophically. This is why copying hardware rarely produces equivalent power. Germany could see the B-17. It could measure its armor. It could count its guns. What it could not replicate was the environment that made the aircraft decisive. The Flying Fortress was not dangerous in isolation. It was dangerous because it was replaceable. That single fact turned every engagement into a losing proposition for the Luftwaffe. Replaceability is rarely glamorous, but it is decisive. This principle appears again and again in history. Armies that rely on elite units struggle once those units are gone. Economies that rely on rare expertise collapse under attrition. Organizations that depend on irreplaceable individuals become brittle. The B-17 reminds us that systems built around replaceable components endure longer than systems built around perfection. Another lesson emerges when we look at the human experience inside the aircraft. B-17 crews did not feel invincible. They felt exposed, cold, terrified, and painfully aware of statistics that predicted death. Survivability was a design feature, not a guarantee. Yet the aircraft gave them something invaluable. A chance to survive damage, a chance to limp home, a chance to learn and fly again. That chance mattered. It preserved morale just enough to sustain the campaign. Total hopelessness collapses forces faster than losses alone. The Flying Fortress never promised safety, but it preserved belief that survival was possible, that returning was not a miracle, but an outcome the aircraft was designed to make more likely. From this comes a profoundly human lesson. Hope, when grounded in reality, is a strategic asset. The B-17 did not rely on false optimism. It relied on engineering that acknowledged danger honestly. That honesty, accepting that crews would be hit, allowed designers to build something that worked in real conditions, not imagined ones. In contrast, doctrines that denied vulnerability collapsed the moment reality intruded. As the war ended, the final verdict became unavoidable. Germany had fought bravely and brilliantly, but it had fought the wrong kind of war against the wrong kind of opponent. The Flying Fortress symbolized that mismatch. It was not designed to outfly the Luftwaffe. It was designed to outlast it. That distinction is everything. The legacy of the B-17 endures because it captures a universal truth. In prolonged struggles, victory belongs to the side that plans for damage, not the side that assumes perfection. Whether in war, politics, business, or human life, systems that survive shock outperform systems that depend on ideal conditions. The Germans asked how many cannon rounds it took to destroy a B-17. They never asked how many mistakes their own system could survive. The answer, revealed slowly and mercilessly in the skies over Europe, was not enough. And that is the final, uncomfortable lesson the Flying Fortress leaves behind. In contests of endurance, the most dangerous enemy is not the one who strikes hardest, but the one who can absorb your best blows, adapt, and return again tomorrow. What the Flying Fortress ultimately revealed was not simply how wars are won, but how power behaves once conflict becomes systemic rather than episodic. Early in the war, both sides still believed in decisive moments, breakthrough raids, perfect tactics, sudden reversals. By the end, those ideas had dissolved. The air war became something colder, slower, and far less dramatic, a contest over who could remain functional the longest under continuous strain. The B-17 thrived in that environment because it was never designed for moments, it was designed for repetition. Every aspect of the fortress reflected this logic. Crews trained not for single missions, but for tours measured in dozens of sorties. Aircraft were maintained with the expectation of damage, not preservation. Factories were organized around flow, not craftsmanship. Nothing was sacred except continuity. As long as bombers could take off tomorrow, the system was alive. This leads to another crucial lesson. Systems that prioritize continuity outperform systems that prioritize peak performance. German aircraft were often masterpieces of engineering, optimized for speed, climb rate, or firepower. But optimization creates fragility. When conditions shift, fuel shortages, pilot losses, manufacturing disruption, optimized systems degrade rapidly. The B-17 was never optimized. It was overbuilt, redundant, and inefficient by design. Those inefficiencies became strengths once the war entered its grinding phase. The fortress also exposed the limits of adaptation when resources are finite. The Luftwaffe adapted constantly. New tactics, new weapons, new formations. But adaptation without depth becomes self-destructive. Each change consumed pilots, time, and material faster than replacements could arrive. Adaptation turned inward, cannibalizing the force it was meant to save. From this emerges a hard truth. Adaptation is only effective when the system can sustain its cost. The United States could afford to adapt repeatedly because it possessed slack, industrial slack, manpower slack, training capacity. Germany could not. Every change narrowed its future options. When the system finally failed, it failed everywhere at once. The B-17 also forces us to reconsider how fear functions in war. German pilots did not fear the fortress because it was unbeatable in combat. They feared it because it represented a future they could not escape. No matter how many bombers were destroyed today, more would come tomorrow. Fear, in this case, was not produced by danger alone, but by predictability. Predictable pressure is more psychologically damaging than unpredictable violence. The bomber streams arrived on schedules. They followed routes. They returned again and again. The human mind can endure chaos better than inevitability. The Flying Fortress transformed the air war into something relentless, stripping defenders of the belief that effort could end the threat. This psychological erosion mattered as much as physical loss. Morale does not collapse when danger appears, it collapses when danger becomes routine and unsolvable. The B-17 also highlights the difference between control and influence. Germany sought control of the skies. Once that failed, it tried to deny them to the enemy. The Allies, by contrast, sought influence. They did not need to eliminate every fighter or flak gun. They needed to shape behavior, force dispersal, drain resources, degrade training, and impose reaction. Influence scales better than control. The fortress exerted influence simply by existing in large numbers. It compelled Germany to respond everywhere, all the time. That constant reaction consumed initiative. And once initiative is lost, recovery becomes exponentially harder. This lesson extends beyond war. In any prolonged competition, economic, political, technological, the side that dictates the pace and forces reaction holds the advantage, even if it appears less impressive in individual exchanges. Another uncomfortable lesson lies in how the B-17 reframed loss itself. Losses were horrific. Crews knew the statistics, yet the system absorbed those losses without collapsing. This is not a moral endorsement, it is an analytical reality. Modern power is measured not by how little you lose, but by how little your losses change your capacity to act. Germany could not afford to lose pilots. The United States could. That asymmetry mattered more than any weapon. The fortress made this asymmetry visible. Each mission asked the same brutal question. Can you stop this without exhausting yourself? The answer, over time, was no. And this brings us to perhaps the most enduring lesson of all. Wars are decided by what cannot be replaced. Aircraft can be built. Weapons can be redesigned. Cities can be rebuilt.